Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you today. My name is Dustin Cormier, and welcome to another episode of How to Rock Astrology. Today, you have embarked on a journey, a theosophical, cross-cultural examination of the outer planets and their lords. This is the introduction to this new series that I've been doing. I'm a tropical Vedic astrologer. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. And in this series, throughout this series, we're going to discuss what I seem to be intuiting to be the proper way to deal with how to quantify the outer planets, how we feel them, how we experience them, through the methods of Vedic astrology, through methods that the Western astrology practice doesn't really consider or know about. A big part of this message of this whole huge part of my whole channel right now is to combine the best of both worlds, from the Vedic astrology as well as from the Western. And the most obvious place that I can hack at right now, that I'm finding some incredible insights for, is this theme of the outer planets and their lords. So stay tuned, because it's going to take us a little bit to get to where I want to be with explaining what I mean when I say their lords. So this series is intended for Vedic people to get a sense of what they're missing in Western astrology, and for Western astrologers to get a sense of what they're missing in Vedic interpretation. There's a comfortable place to sit with these folks, and I aim to explain. So, welcome. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I've got my notebook here with some notes on it and stuff, so if you're wondering, I'm going to be looking at my notes, and it's going to help me ground what I'm trying to say in this video. Now I'm just going to jump right into it. My name's Dustin Cormier. I guess I'll show you guys, give you guys a quick little glimpse. I like to do this for all my videos. Oh, do I have it figured out right now? I've got a picture of my chart, or at least a little glimpse. Oh, I know where it is. I'm going to give you just a quick little glimpse of my own chart, just so you can see. Some of you probably have seen this already anyway. For those watching, this is a quick little shot of the most important parts of my chart. I'm a Leo rising, Scorpio sun, Sagittarius moon. My Chinese astrology, I always like to give you a glimpse of that, just so you can see the context of the person giving you the information. It's always important, I think. So, my name's Dustin Cormier. I'm a tropical Vedic astrologer. I'm going to give a quick little short thrift as to what I mean by that. My roots are in Western astrology. I was a Western astrologer, interested in regular hippie Aquarian astrology for like years before I got into Vedic astrology. Now, here's this concern. I use the measurements that the West uses, but I use Vedic interpretation of those measurements. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, I am born on November 8th. Now, us in the West, you must know that for a chart of someone born on November 8th, it's right in the middle of Scorpio. This is a picture of my chart. And you can see here, hopefully you guys can see this. I always like to check. Good. You can see here that this is my Western chart. And I go by the coordinates of Scorpio, of the sun having been at 16 degrees of Scorpio. Now, some people think that Vedic astrology, whenever you hear that, it makes you think that your signs are like 24 degrees behind. And we can see from here, this is my sidereal chart using the sidereal rishis. Sidereal means pertaining to the stars, and this is the old way of interpreting a Vedic horoscope. So this would assume that my sun is actually in a Libra, You know, if you ever ask a Vedic astrologer who's not in the know about what I'm talking about, then they'll say, oh, you are a sign behind, right? I was a Leo in my Western chart. Now I'm a Cancer with Libra sun. But I do not go by this measurement. I use tropical measurements. So that my sun is effectively at 16 degrees Scorpio, even though I'm using, as you can see, the Vedic chart, with the square and with all these things, you know, the southern chart. So I digress. If you want to find your own Vedic chart using Western measurements, look up vaultoftheheavens.com. It's what Ernst Wilhelm has built for those of us using the Western measurements, the tropical measurements to be exact, through Vedic interpretation. So I digress. I just wanted to show you guys a little bit of that just to get the context of what's going on here. I'm going to be going in between my notebook and the pictures that I've made for you guys. This video is a mutual call from the middle of two very different cultural vantage points, as we can clearly tell. Here we have the reasons that I'm making this video. As a Western astrologer, I want to point out... I'm going to get there. Got to organize my thoughts. The reasons for this video is that we can see there's a wisdom that traditional Vedic astrology has in interpreting the whole horoscope. Now, traditional Western astrology, it's missing a lot of the Vedic interpretation. But what the West has is the recent use of the telescope and the introduction of the outer planets to the interpretation of a chart. What I'm trying to do for this video, as we can see in the middle, is Satya. Satya in Vedic meaning discerned truth, after experimentation and intuition on all things brought together. I'm looking for a peaceful dialogue about the discernible truths between these two traditions. And in order to start, we're going to start at my base camp and the tradition that I was in before I got into Vedic astrology. And that's the traditional Western. What can the West teach Vedic astrologers? So if you're a Vedic astrologer, you're about to hear what it is that the outer planets have to offer, or at least a little bit. Again, if you're a Westerner, believe me, you're going to want to hear this too, because this is speaking to both sides. So, the reasons for this video. Again, I want to check to make sure you can see what I'm at. Good. I aim to clarify. As I have roots in Western astrology, to the Vedic astrologers in my audience, I would like to point out that to Vedic astrology's detriment, the ancient Vedic astrology, it did not consider the effects of Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto in the horoscope. Let me just make an important call, because I make these slides, and the way I worded this is funny because the Western tradition also did not have the outer planets. The Western tradition, the outer planets were only considered in like the 60s, I think. Possibly, oh no. They were talking about them at the start of the 19th century. Even Aleister Crowley to my knowledge, talked about Uranus. I'm not sure if he talked about Pluto, but astrologers were talking in the Western camp about the outer planets in the late 1800s. I'm going to make constant calls to my audience here to help me out with some dates about when did they start discovering and considering the outer planets, because my education officially is in Vedic astrology, even though I started in the West. I've taken schooling in Vedic astrology. But I digress. The point is that they were talking about the outer planets circa like the late 1800s, I believe, through the use of telescopes and trying to bring the outer planets and their meanings to today. But for thousands of years, nobody knew about the outer planets until the telescope was invented. And that's true of Vedic as well as Western. The reason this slide means to say that Vedic has not picked up the outer planets. So, what's that all about? Why specifically does the Vedic tradition kind of like shun and not think about the outer planets? Well, the outer planets being Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Vedic astrology considers, they have a whole epistemology. Like, astrology is just a branch of Vedanta and Veda, which is a whole philosophy of India unto itself. And it's a very beautiful philosophy. And their science and their epistemology, how they know what they know, is very intelligent, very cool. They have a whole thing. Vic Dakara, the YouTuber, has a whole course on the epistemology of the Vedas. It's called the Tattva Sandarbha. I highly recommend it. So the Indian Vedic astrologers are really into ancient scriptural re-evidence of what is important to an astrology chart. We're going to talk about that. So telescopes were not invented to see those planets, the outer planets, during the time when the great sages of Vedic India were channeling their astrological insights. Much of all Vedic traditions, all astrology traditions, are based on like intuition and then observation. Observation of what these seers were saying. The seers would talk about astrology, and then astrologers would do charts and say, oh, Parashar is right. When a person has the sun in Scorpio, they display Scorpio qualities. Look at that, right? It's the intuition comes first, and then we quantify through our research, through astrologers doing astrology. So, sages, ancient Vedic sages, the Vedic people who will know who I'm talking about, like Parashara, Jaimini, Satyachara. My interpretation is that the sages knew that the outer planets existed. Right? Now consider that. These ancient sages knew that the outer planets, like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, that they existed. But there's two things that derailed it so that Vedic astrology didn't keep the knowledge of these planets. It's possible that they never talked about those planets. Now, why would these ancient sages who had such clairvoyancy not talk about these important planets that we know in modern days have so much to do with the astrology chart? These ancient sages, we're going way back here. We're going like 3,000 years ago, possibly more, in a time when the Vedic tradition used their eyes, what they could see, possibly very basic, primitive telescope vibey things, but they could only use their eyes and what they could see in the night sky and very crazy ways to access what the seers were trying to say and making astrology charts, because the seers didn't need astrology charts. These were anciently brilliant geniuses who could just see it all. So these seers transmitted their mystical vision to acolytes and disciples who lacked their clairvoyance. Most of the disciples of these seers and sages didn't have the sight, the inner wisdom. So the question becomes, this is a depiction of the sage Parashara. The question becomes, why would the sage Parashara waste time speaking about Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto if the astrologers of his day were not able to realistically measure those planets in the horoscope until 3,000 years later? Why the hell is he even going to talk about it? If he says, like, you know, like, the guy is only going to live so long, and he knows that. So he wanted to give them the basics for interpreting the horoscope in the most rich way possible. So for him to talk about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, he would have to, like, he could only speak to it so much. It's not like he could just mark out the exact placement where these planets are going to be, because even that was tough for this guy to do. He's just talking about the archetypes of the planets. So, whether or not these sages did talk about these planets, the astrologers who did the research, because we're even talking about a time where everything is by rote speech. This is before writing could even hardly be done. So even though this guy, he's writing in this thing, you know, writing could be done, but it was such a meticulous process. So astrologers would hear the word from the clairvoyant. And if the clairvoyant sage talked about those planets, they couldn't hold it in their minds because they couldn't see those planets in the sky. They couldn't practice with those planets. So this is, you know, so why would Parashara do that if would he talk about these planets if astrologers couldn't use them until 3,000 years later? It'd be like a waste of his time. The sages knew of them because they were clairvoyant. We may not have heard anything because the only thing that ever sticks through thousands of years of the eroding sands of time are things that can be comprehended by those who are interpreting and digesting the figures in the scripture. We're talking about people who would say words and then people would repeat their words. And it's like a game of telephone. Things get lost. But certain things did stay. And certain things, what did stay, like talking about Mars, you know, Parashara would say something about Mars and the fact that Mars rules Aries and Scorpio. And it has this vibe. It's a warrior, kshatriya, caste. People could speak about that, understand it, and then see Mars in the sky and say, ah, yes, what he's saying correlates with the fact that we see people being born when Mars is here, and these people show those behaviors. They embody them. So we can correlate what the seer is saying. They couldn't do that with the outer planets, right? Now, this whole thing is very important. Everything I've just said is important for two reasons. Number one, this does not discredit the ancient sages of Vedic astrology for not talking about these planets. Parashara was not, I personally don't think that Parashara or Jaimini or any of those guys, they weren't ignorant to the higher chakras that the outer planets represent. Number two, this shows that there is room for these planets, the outer planets, in the framework of a modern Vedic interpretation of the horoscope. It's as if these guys gave us the groundwork for how to interpret what is really the energy field. My interpretation is that the outer planets aren't really even, they're like not parts of the chakras or the energy field in the same way that the first five, the seven luminaries are: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They're planets, but they aren't quite as embodied in the energy field as a chakra, etc., as the other planets are. But they work through those seven luminaries. They work through the seven planets. And as all of this goes to say is that, there is room for the outer planets in the modern framework of a Vedic interpretation in the modern day. It's a good thing, in fact, that the Vedic sages gave us this grounded sense of the other 7 planets, which, again, Western astrology doesn't have. And we're going to talk about that right now. So, next, we're going to talk about, I've talked about the fact that the West has the outer planets, and Vedic astrology doesn't. Now, what does Vedic astrology have that the West doesn't? This is going to constitute the bulk of this series, is me talking about what it is that Vedic astrology has to offer the interpretation of the outer planets. There's a bunch of things regarding the outer planets, regarding all the planets actually, that the West needs to hear. And I keep building it up, so I'm just going to just talk about it. For millennia, Vedic astrology has refined its interpretation of the basics. They have a different, much deeper way. There's a lot that Vedic astrology went into that the Babylonian, Greek roots of astrology never really touched on. So, this includes a deeper interpretation of the signs, the planets, something called the nakshatras, which is a whole other conversation in itself. If you ask me, I'm going to say at some point, but it's like half of astrology that the West is missing out. But we're not going to talk about the nakshatras in this Outer Planets series. But there's lots about the mythos of the planets that's missing in the West, including, there's so many beautiful stories in the Veda that reflect deep layers of consciousness for each planet. Now, these, though, the signs and the planets, the West does talk about them, and it has its own ways of talking about them. The next part, which is specifically very important to our discussion, it's these two figures here. The West has no idea about. Some Westerners might talk about them. I don't think, to my knowledge, that I've heard of any Westerner that talks about the Lord of a sign. And it's because the way the houses are calculated, where the house cusps land in the West, all of this fidgeting about the house cusps has reduced their capacity to talk about house lords. Now, if you're a Westerner, just be patient, because I'm going to slowly unfold what this is all about. It's the strength and prosperity of the lords of the signs as carriers of house energy. The West already knows that there's an ascendant lord, for example. So let's say I'm a Leo rising. The sun rules Leo, which means that wherever the sun is in my chart is going to be deeply important to my whole chart, because it carries the energy of the first house. And the first house is the physical path of life, that is the physical earthly expression of the self. Now, some Western traditions might consider that there's a second house lord, and there's a third house lord, and there's a fourth house lord. And wherever these lords are in the chart, define the quality of that house. For example, you might have a positive planet in Scorpio, like Venus and Jupiter in Scorpio, and those planets are going to help Scorpio. But the West doesn't consider that where Mars is, and Mars' aspects, Mars' strength, is the carrier for Scorpio and for whatever house it is, right? So, I digress. That's a huge part. Even just that is a secret key, wink wink, to what I'm going to be talking about when we get into how to quantify the strength of the outer planets and what we're going to experience them as in our chart, in transit and natally. The other key important part is dasha periods. It's called something called Vimshatari. And this is something the West has actually, nobody in the West has any idea about dasha periods. I'm going to talk about them once we get rolling. But basically, you're just going to have to hear about it, get the idea of it, and then if you're interested in Vedic astrology, research it for yourself. But it's something that's very exclusive to Vedic astrology. So this is this checklist that I'm talking about, right? For millennia, Vedic astrology has refined its interpretation of these basics. This is the ground that, it's a certain ground that the West doesn't consider in regards to its whole practice, in my opinion. Strength and prosperity of the lords of the signs as carriers of house energy, and this thing called the dasha periods. These are the fundamental ground on which all aspects of astrology depend, including the outer planets. Now, I don't want to get too boring and just give them short thrift with and just tease you with all this stuff without, this is just an intro video for this series. And I am kind of teasing you towards what kind of knowledge we're going to get. For you Vedic people as well as for you Western people. It's going to take a lot for the Westerners to digest what's being given here. But there's a clear open door. For anybody who's in the Vedic tradition, seeing what I'm talking about, the lords, obviously, dasha periods, it's all very obvious. And I invite all of you to try this interpretation once we get it on rolling as to the outer planets and see how it affects your own experience. See how the outer planets affect your experience. One thing I will say is that Western astrology skips the most critical element of quantifying all of the planets. It seems to me that the West kind of just like the Western astrology tradition really just wants to absorb the to learn about the craziness of Uranus, the spirituality of Uranus, to learn about the crazy spirituality of Neptune, the deep romantic idealism and delusion and all these things, in order that they can find out where they're deluding themselves in their lives. Oh, Neptune's in my 6th house. Maybe it's really hard for me to work on my habits and keeping my bank account steady and my routines and these sorts of things. The West seems to want to understand the chaos these planets imply, see if they can affect us, and then try to protect themselves from the influence of these outer planets because they're the heavy whack ones, right? It's like there's an attraction to spirituality, that spiritual chaos in the West. Ironically, when you consider the nature of these higher chakra, spiritual, ecstatic planets, most people who are in a period that relates to these planets feels this internal ecstasy and this dissolving and this crazy Uranus energy or this powerful, unmanageable Pluto energy. They feel them and they just throw up their arms and say, oh, wow, okay, this is too much. I see that, this is this crazy energy. Oh, I'm going through this experience. And what you eventually, in the Western tradition right now is reflecting an outer planet experience because we've just discovered them. It's like these chakras are waking up in us in a conscious way all over the planet. That being the case, we don't, just like when you're in an outer planet experience, you don't know how to deal with it until after you've really gone through it. And it's like after you've gone through it, it kind of goes away and you grip onto things in your material reality, in your ego, in your psyche, that have been refined, have been destroyed, have been tested, challenged, often knocked off, you eventually, after you've lost hold of a lot of these important things, the mercurial leftover residue of your material life, of your ego, of your psyche, that's what you got to use to pick up the pieces, and that will be transformed, and it will be different, but it's going to be some form. It's going to be some psyche, some ego. You don't completely wipe away your ego, no matter how much we think as 7th, 8th chakra people that we can obliterate our ego completely. Something's got to be left in order for you to deal in the material reality. It takes a spiritual tantra to painstakingly integrate the tones of these outer octave planets into our lives. And the thing is with Western astrology is that an astrologer might just tell you, oh, you're in a Uranus period. And you ask, okay, how do I deal with it? And the Western astrologer just only knows how to tell you what Uranus is all about. Well, just hold on to something for dear life and let the lightning flash through you, as they say. And they might be able to tell you some things according to your house and conjunctions. Let's say if Uranus is transiting and it's conjunct your sun, then it's going to have all these sun things that relates to the sun that you're going to have to deal with. Of course, like for a Leo rising like me, Uranus transiting my sun by any aspect is going to be a super crazy heavy thing. Because the sun is my first lord in my chart. But for anyone else, like a Scorpio rising, the sun is the 10th lord. Leo is the 10th house from Scorpio. So the sun is the 10th lord. And if Uranus is transiting there, it could mean a whole crazy world according to what the 10th house means to you. This is part of what I'm talking about that the West is missing out on. I digress. A huge part of what I'm trying to say here is that if that was someone's experience, it would be good for an astrologer to talk about how it's your 10th house that is A, what's being destroyed and rattled by Uranus, but B, what's going to be the counterpoint, the thing that you need to realize, deal with consciously, and get through your career, your constant life activities that you deal with, the things that keep you really, like your 10th house is the most active house. It brings you more energy than any other planet in your chart, as your whatever your ascendant is. So, having Uranus transit your 10th lord is just like Uranus transiting your 10th house. These are all the things that are in our energy field that are transforming when we go through a transit. And these are the things that we need to ground in order to deal with the energy, to integrate its lessons, to find out what we should let go of, but also what we should keep. That's the area where we should be observing that. Vedic astrology embraces the divine within the temporary, the divine within Maya, the illusion, the painful, the ego. Vedic astrology recognizes these dimensions of the psyche, of the material body, of the past, of your karma, as the dark night of the soul, through which the golden dawn of self-illumination may shine. These are things to consider, Inexperienced astrologers love to play on your feelings, the feelings of chaos in your life. Even if they're innocently interested in healing you, this is our game, is that we're healing each other through our knowledge of astrology. And once an astrologer knows about Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, it's their first instinct to look for these things in a chart and say, oh, wow, so you must be going through this heavy outer planet thing. They want to see a problem and then give you a solution right away as soon as possible. And it might not be like exactly according to what they think. It's just often they look for the obvious thing because you're paying them money and they want to look useful to you. Just these are all things you got to consider, you know? Again, I digress. By focusing on the outer planets and the themes of the outer planets, Western astrology has turned its eyes away from the fundamental ground of horoscope interpretation, in my opinion. This is what Vedic astrology can bring to the West. This is one of those things that's like talking about like acid or like a psychedelic. It's like you can talk about it, but or like, you know, trying to describe the color orange to someone who's never had one. It's like, how do you talk about it? Vedic astrology to the Westerner is this way. It's hard to talk about all the things that the West is missing out on. When you try to quantify any planet, there's a whole checklist of things to consider. And I hate to say it, but it's very deep, it's very thick, and it's very significant in defining any planet influence, including how these outer planets will affect us. I'll show you this checklist in the third video in our series. But before we do, there's some more personal points about the planets that we need to clarify. And we're gonna get there, folks. Now, if you're interested in Vedic astrology and all the ways that I'm talking about how to interpret the horoscope Vedically, there's a book that I recommend. I was supposed to have it out already. This is my greatest, for me, this is the greatest book that brought me into Vedic. As a Westerner, I read this and I was like, oh my God, this is totally where I'm supposed to be. It's Light on Life by Hart Defau and Robert Svadova, an introduction to the astrology of India. Just going to give you a few more resources here. On top of that, there are people working on YouTube who are working out what is called tropical Vedic astrology. It's astrology, tropical. There's probably lots of people who are in my camp I'm preaching to the choir here. But for anybody who's not in my camp, I recommend the following astrologers. Ernst Wilhelm is the patriarch of tropical Vedic astrology, he created the Kala software. He's got the deep essence of so many of these truths, and he has classes dedicated to teaching Vedic astrology. In my opinion, I think that he's either a Leo or he's got like Sun at Makaraka. Geez, I was just reminded that I was supposed to say, if you're still watching, let me just consider for Vedic people, it's the Dasha and the Atmakarakas. The Atmakarakas and the Dashas are the other critical important factor when interpreting how a Uranus transit or a Pluto or a Neptune transit is going to affect you. Because if any of those outer planets are transiting an Atmakaraka planet, it's deeply, deeply like past life resurgence of an important theme that is going to be important, is going to lay the karma for how you're going to deal with your soul, your identity, the essence of what you are for possibly lifetimes to come. The Jaimini Karakas, as well as the Dasha periods, because if you're in a Dasha of like right now I'm in Venus Mahadasha and Uranus is in Taurus. We're going to piece together what these kind of things mean as we go along in our classes. But I'm sure anybody who's reading where I'm at is going to get why that would be important. I digress. Ernst Wilhelm is, he's got like Sun at Makaraka, I think. Don't quote me on that, but he's got a deep essence of these things. Although he doesn't give you the groundwork that Ryan does. Ryan is a student of Ernst's. And Ryan is my teacher. I'm in year 3 of his astrology apprenticeship course. I highly recommend all his videos We're getting a basic startup on what tropical Vedic astrology is all about. Another personal favorite of mine is Vic Dakara. He teaches tropical Vedic astrology with a special respect for what are called the 27 nakshatras. It's a zodiac which is completely unknown in the West, again, but which honestly constitutes at least half of the astral data available to astrologers. Now, I took a few little thrifty left turns and right turns in this, but I think I got to where I want to be. This has been the introduction to this has been an introduction, folks, to the outer planets and their lords as given in the Neotropical Vedic astrology. I'm inclined to say tradition, but it's not a tradition yet. We're working on it. This is a new way it's a real cross-cultural examination of things, and it's very much a Dustin Cormier thing. I hope you guys are enjoying it. I would love to see in the comments what you guys think of this video. Please let me know. Let me know if you're a Vedic guy, whether this is of interest to you, if you're a Western guy, if this is of interest to you, and let me know about those few people who, like me, are interested in finding the satya, the discerning truth that exists in the middle of all the cultural phrasings. Thanks a lot for watching, folks, and keep your eyes peeled because we got more videos in this series to come.